Hi everyone, hope you're doing really well. I've got quite a simple message for you this week, which I hope will be really encouraging to you. It's about a man of simple faith called Nehemiah. And Nehemiah was a man who God put on his heart to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem many years after they'd been destroyed by the Babylonians. And Nehemiah at this time was living in Persia. He was working for the king of Persia as a cupbearer, a really important role. And he would have been living in quite a bit of luxury in the palaces of the king. But despite him being so far away from Jerusalem, his heart was still very much with his people, and he was sensitive to their needs and the fact that they were vulnerable and they didn't have a wall around them, didn't have defences. And Nehemiah, one thing we can say about him, he was single-minded. He was a very faithful man. He was focused on the task at hand, as we'll see. And he was focused on God. Just about every sentence, as you read it, has God in it, that Nehemiah says. And you can see where his heart is centred. And Nehemiah goes back to Jerusalem and he starts building this wall. And he says, "Remember me, oh my God, for good." And God did. And this wall wasn't built by master builders. It wasn't built by craftsmen. It was built by 40 different families who Nehemiah worked with. And each of those 40 families were responsible for a different section of that wall as it was being built. So it meant that there was priests building this wall, and there was perfumers and goldsmiths and cupbearers. There was men and women, young and old. And it made the task difficult because they weren't skilled builders. And it's a little bit like if the church in New Life Church was to go down to the centre of Ottery and start building a wall around the centre there. Maybe each of the families would be responsible for a different section, and anybody looking on would be saying, what a difficult task they set themselves. You've got accountants building, and dentists, and lawyers, and teachers, and IT specialists, and marketing managers. And they've set themselves this almost impossible task, haven't they, to do this thing. But Nehemiah felt that this is what God was asking him to do. And as if that wasn't hard enough, he was also surrounded by opposition on all sides. As you read the book of Nehemiah, there's people telling him why he shouldn't be doing this thing. And Oliver, my son, has helped by developing a bit of a model out with his Lego characters, very helpfully to show this. And you can see Nehemiah here building his wall. And surrounding him were lots of different people. First of all, there were his enemies over here, who didn't want him to build the wall, and they were saying things like, "What are these feeble Jews doing now? Will they bring stones back to life from these piles of rubble? Whatever they build, if even a fox goes up onto it, he will break down their stone wall." And then you had the people from his own working group who were disillusioned, and they were saying things like, "Our strength is failing, Nehemiah. There is so much rubbish that we are not able to build the wall properly." And then you also had his friends over here who were other Jews in the area, and they were worried that if Nehemiah built this wall, it would attract attack and from the enemies. So they were saying things like, "If you build this wall, our enemies will come and attack us. Your hands are too weak for this work. It will not get finished." And the Bible says that these friends didn't just come once and say these negative words, but they came 10 times over to give this negative message and false prophecies. And it was almost like Nehemiah's surrounded by this whirlwind of opposition and negativity. And do you know what he did? He didn't just think, right, I'm going to stop building, this is a crazy task, I can't do this on my own. He didn't run away and hide like his friends suggested he should in case these enemies attacked. He was expecting the invasion at any moment. He didn't go and hide. He didn't even give in to the temptation that must have been in the back of his head and run back to Persia and back to his life of luxury and just think, what a crazy project, I don't know what I was doing then. He didn't do any of that. He stood in the middle of that storm, all that negativity and opposition around him, and he raised his hands and he said, "Oh God, strengthen my hands. Oh God, strengthen my hands." Such a simple prayer, such a single-minded focus. And he carried on despite the opposition. And they came up with ideas. They said, right, what we're going to do is with your right hand, you're going to be holding your hammer and your tools for building the wall. And in your left hand, you're going to be holding your weapons. So if these enemies do come and attack, you're going to be ready. So literally be there with a shield or a spear or a sword in one hand and a hammer and a chisel in the other hand, building this wall. And he also said, we'll give a trumpet to each of the families around this wall. And if you do get attacked at your part of the wall, blow the trumpet and we'll come from all the other sections and help fight the enemy with you. It says, whenever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. Whenever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us. There, our God will fight for us. It's brilliant. And I guess you could say that despite this opposition, Nehemiah would have looked around with his eyes and seen all these opponents around him and used his ears to hear these negative words. And it looked like he was surrounded by opposition, but Nehemiah knew that it looked like that, but in reality, he was surrounded by God. And it reminds me a bit of that song that we sing. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. And do you know what the amazing thing is? Nehemiah actually finished that wall with those builders and those opponents around him. And he didn't only finish it, but he finished it in 52 days, which is kind of remarkable. And the enemies never did attack. Those messages that he got over and over again, the enemies never did come and attack. And it was actually the enemies at the end who actually said this. It says, they saw that it was only by God that it was done. So these enemies looked on at Nehemiah and this crazy group building this crazy wall. But they knew that there was more going on because of the progress they were having. They knew there was a greater power at work there, and they saw God at work. And it was his enemies who bore witness to God's power. And this reminds me a little bit of Jesus on the cross. Jesus was surrounded by his own opposition, wasn't he? He dealt with pain, betrayal, rejection, sin on that cross. Surrounded by enemies. And when all the violence stopped and the insults stopped and the earthquake had happened and the curtain had been torn down the centre and the sky had gone dark in the middle of the day, it says there was a centurion up on the hill overlooking that crucifixion. And he recognised there was more at work here. There was a greater power going on. And he said, surely he really was the Son of God. And that centurion bore witness to God's power, just like Nehemiah's enemies bore witness to God's power. And, sorry, go back to that illustration. And I just wanted to share, I just wondered if there was any young people watching this today, young people either in person or in heart. And sometimes in life we're surrounded by difficult situations and difficult people. Maybe when we're at school we've got bullies or teachers who we don't get on with, or friends who say nasty things, or difficult homework that we're dreading, or tests, or illness in the family, or illness yourself. And we've got these opponents around us in difficult situations, and we might feel overwhelmed, we might feel helpless when we look around and think this is just too much for me to bear. But we can always remember that actually we're not surrounded by those awful things. We're actually surrounded by God, and he's right with you, and he's the power to get you through. It may look like you're surrounded, but you're surrounded by him. And the great thing is about having a God who's often invisible, most of the time he's invisible to us, is that he can be everywhere and anywhere all the time. You might think of its downside as he's invisible, but really it's a positive, isn't it? Because he can be everywhere with us. He can be with each one of us in our own situation. And I had an example of this actually at church last week. We ended the time of worship. We do our worship over Zoom in the church that we go to up here. And a lady who I'd never seen before shared that she had an overwhelming sensation of just how close Jesus was to her at that moment, and how easy it is for us to forget just how close Jesus is to us. And it reminded her of when she was at boarding school as an 8-year-old, and she was far away from her parents and feeling very, very lonely, as you can imagine. And at that time, that was her first sensation of just how close Jesus was to her when she was missing those people who she loved. He's right there with us, isn't he? And I don't know about you, but sort of even now, sort of 20 years on or more from when I was a kid, there's still situations, isn't there, where we're surrounded by difficult situations. So it might be money situations, or maybe not finding a job, or doing a job that you really don't enjoy, or relationships, falling out with friends, maybe illness yourself or with loved ones. And it's still really encouraging to me to just know that those things are surrounding me. But time and time again, I've realised that God is right there with me and just waiting to get me through those situations and to walk through them with me. It may look like you're surrounded, but you're surrounded by him. And I had a real experience of this about 18 months ago when I went for a job that was quite a bit higher than the job I was doing at the time. And there was lots of reasons why I was anxious about going for that job. I was worried, what happens if I don't actually get it, or if the person I sit next to gets it, what will people think of me if I fail? I was worried that I was going to miss the things I enjoyed about the current job I was doing, because it was quite comfortable. I had a nice 9 till 5 job and a nice commute and a nice boss. And I remember each step of the way through that process praying that God would only allow me to get the job if he was going to go with me to do that new job, because I was kind of terrified. It was a step up from where I was. I didn't actually know if I could do it. And I had a real sensation that it would be crazy for me to not do something just because it was a bit scary if I felt like God was asking me to do it, because that situation I was in currently that was so comfortable to me, I thought overnight he could just change that. He could take all of that away anyway if he wanted to, or if he needed to. So I went for that job and ended up getting it, which is fantastic. And God did go with me through it. And just 2 days after I got that new job, I went down to London, and we got told that my previous job that I just moved out of 2 days before, everybody in the country doing that role was going to be made redundant that following week. And I remember thinking, just being overwhelmed by just how God had not only answered my prayer of going with me into that new situation. Just 2 days in, he was with me, but he'd actually gone ahead of me, and he was looking out for me. And he actually used me in that situation to help some of the people who had gone into redundancy. I was in a position then to actually recruit some of those people back into different positions and just see God's grace really in that situation. And he gave me a vision at that time, and he said, Steve, do you remember when there's a time we were coming back from Plymouth actually with Oliver and Joseph, 2 little boys in the back of my beat up Clio, and we were going up Holden Hill and we broke down. And it was in the middle of the rain, in the darkness, on a corner, halfway up Holden Hill. And we broke down in the inside lane. And I phoned 999 and said, we're broken down, we're blocking the traffic. And the first thing the woman said to me on the phone was, make sure you get out of the car and stand on the verge. And I said, but that's crazy, I've got 2 little kids and it's raining and it's dark. Aren't we safer in the car? And she said, the worst place you can be is in that car, because you're going to get hit if anyone comes around that corner. So we quickly got out and we were huddling on the side, these 2 little boys clinging on to me clinging on to them more actually, if I'm honest. And eventually a police car came along, flashing lights, pulled up behind me, came out and said, right, now that I'm here, it's fine for you to get back in the car. And I said, but the woman on the phone said that's the most dangerous place for me to be. That's not where I'm safe with with my kids. And the policeman said to me, you'll be fine now, because if anyone's going to get hit, it's going to be me, because I'm parked behind you. And then obviously the tow truck came along and we got taken off. And God just gave me that image of what that must have looked like. So there we were huddled in our little beat up Clio, being towed by the tow truck going ahead of us, with a police car behind us with the flashing lights on. And God said to me, not only will I go with you into this new job, but I'm going to go ahead of you, and I'm going to make sure that you're backed up from behind as well. Nothing's going to attack you from the decisions that you made behind you as well. You don't need to worry about the past all the time. I'll be there as well. So I'll be ahead of you, I'll be with you, and I'll be behind you. And that was really, really powerful to me 18 months ago. And every single day since then, going into work, going up the A19, I've prayed that. I've said, Lord Jesus, please go ahead of me into this situation. I don't know what I'm going into. Please go with me and help me to cope with it. And please help me, the decisions I've made, I'm making numerous ones a day, that they wouldn't catch me up, that you would be in that as well and protecting me from behind. And I just wanted to share that with you today, this idea that you're surrounded by him, he's with you, and he's closer than you think. And I want you to write that on your heart, really. And you may feel like that little 8-year-old girl at boarding school, looking out the window, missing the parents. You might be missing family and friends who we haven't been able to see for a long time. But I want you to know that Jesus is with you this week, and he's closer than you can ever imagine. Blessings. See you later.